Hi, I'm Bill Keller with Beyond the Office, leading and building remote teams. And on today's episode, we have a special guest, Jim Wall, business coach and business consultant. And one of the reasons that we wanted to have Jim on the show with us today is because he works with us at Staffing Global to help grow our people. And we're excited to have you on today. How are you today, Jim?
Bill, I'm doing great. It's very good to see you again.
Well, it's great to see you and great to spend some time with you this morning. We always appreciate your words of wisdom and the way that you help our people. I've known Jim for many, many years. I worked with him when I was at a previous company, and it's just been an awesome relationship. And over the years, we've got to know each other even more, and I appreciate his wisdom. And if you look behind him in his setup, that's not a virtual background like you see many people have. Those are all of Jim's books, and you can see that, like me, that's one of the reasons I think we get along so well, is he is an avid reader and just sucks up the information. But the great thing is he's able to then use that information to impart it to others. So great to have you on the show today. So we're going to get started here. Go ahead, Jim.
Oh, just going to say thanks again, Bill, for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And I also remember those many conversations you and I would have over the years, and certainly have valued our friendship and relationship.
Well, the feeling's mutual. So I want to dive into first about your coaching. What's driven you to pursue coaching? Because that's not necessarily where you started in your career, but I know it's your love and it's your passion.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. So my background's actually in operations and marketing, and I did both of those things for many years. As I was doing that work, I realized how much I enjoyed mentoring younger leaders and seeing them flourish. So in addition to seeing that in my professional life, I also saw in my personal life, people would approach me and ask me to, hey, can you mentor me? And after a while, it became evident, wow, this is something that I enjoy. I found it rewarding. So then in 2017, I started taking steps to become credentialed by the International Coaching Federation, and then achieved my credential as a coach in 2020. So a couple of years after that, I made the leap. I became self-employed as a full-time coach consultant. Bill, in the last few years, God's been good. He's continued to provide not only for our finances, but I have found great joy in this work also.
And that's evident as you work with our people. We see that passion and that love for coaching and for people. So we really appreciate that. As you work with both people from India, the US, and Colombia, how would you compare and contrast how you approach coaching, the coaching experience in each country and culture? Is there a difference there that you see?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for coaching, consulting in the US, typically I'm working with business owner, potentially his or her key leadership team. I view my role as not necessarily going in as a consultant and telling them what to do. If they need subject matter experts, they can get those. I view my job here with US-based teams as I come alongside them to help walk them through growth strategies around their business opportunities. Those are usually fairly engaged conversations. So I see that as my role there. For India and Colombia, actually, Bill, my focus is to execute on your goal, your desired goal, which is, it's a great goal. Your goal is to maximize the personal and professional potential of any employee that comes on board in one of your companies. So coaching for me in India and Colombia tends to focus on that personal and professional development for the talented people that your companies hire.
It's always been a passion of mine. I shouldn't say always, but I don't know, for at least 20 or 30 years, people have spoken into my life, and I felt that it's imperative that I give that opportunity to others. And some of you might already know that I have a twofold mission in life, and it's give people opportunities and to help them to grow. And so while I love doing coaching myself, I don't always get the time to do it. So it's important enough that we bring people like Jim onto the team to help our people, to give them the opportunities that they might not get themselves in their country or the place where they live. So I really appreciate that you're an extension of that.
Thank you, Bill. I think it's one of the reasons you and I got along so well over the years. I think you and I have a sort of a basic outward perspective of, okay, I'm going to be working with people, alongside people. I'll either have employees or however that looks, however that's structured. The reality is, for you and me, I believe the part of our approach and the thing that we resonate with together is, okay, we have this opportunity in the context of a business to help people grow, reach their potential, thrive, develop. Yeah, and I think that's a wavelength that you and I have both experienced over the years.
And this is where people spend the most time. You probably
right?
you spend more time at work than you do with your spouse or at home or even probably even sleeping. And so, this is the opportunity to make a real difference here. And people often say, oh, okay, I go work here, but then I make a difference over at this charity or other place. And I think the real work is actually at work to make a difference in people's lives. So
right. And Bill, if you don't mind, I'll push that one step further. And people are certainly welcome to disagree with this, but I think essentially what you're talking about is a mindset. So like ultimately, what is the purpose of my business as a business owner or as a key leader in a business? What are we about? What are we doing here? What is our why, if you want to use that terminology? And a part of that is a mindset toward, hey, how about if we're maximizing the potential of our team? Not only is there, like, in my opinion, an inherent joy in that, I think there's literally a competitive advantage to that. An ROI that comes when, by and large, your approach to your business is, let's bring out the best in our people. And then what you see downstream of that is increased performance. And I say that carefully because I don't believe in manipulating people into performance, but I think if you bring out their potential, you naturally see them get into spaces where their performance does improve. And that is literally a competitive advantage.
And for me, it's exciting. So it's something that brings me a lot of great joy. So as you go through the coaching process, do you see people react differently in the different countries to the coaching process? So when you're working in India or Colombia, is compared to people that you worked with in the US, how do they respond differently?
Yeah, so great question. Yeah, to go back to how I typically would look at US-based companies, they very much lean toward a results orientation. We all want to get things done. It's a results orientation. And they want to know that there's an ROI, some return on investment that they can put their finger on. They can identify that. And hey, by the way, that's a good thing. And it goes well with coaching and consulting, because one of the things I do as a coach consultant is I help leaders set up accountability structure toward the goals that they've identified. So if they're achieving the goals that they've identified as key for their business, for them personally and for their business, that's going to naturally bring about an ROI. For India and Colombia, I think the dynamic of the coaching sessions tends to lean maybe a bit toward the fact that I'm older, of a fair amount of business experience. So when I'm working with your team members, Bill, I find that they appreciate that learning, that business experience that I've gone through. And I think that they appreciate the opportunity to interact with an older person, which is a long way of saying, I think my gray hair and glasses fooled them. Don't tell them I said this, but it's the gray hair and glasses might be my advantage.
Yeah.
I will say this, in any and all cases, no matter where you are in the world, the best thing about coaching is when a client, be it a team member of yours or someone I'm working with in the US, the best scenario is when a client has what we call an aha moment. It's a moment where they figure out something they haven't quite been able to put together before. Wow, those are special moments for them, and they're special moments for me.
I love when people, like you said, that aha moment, how do you bring that about? And that's the thing with a coach that you've been trained to do, is not just giving them, coming and answering their questions, but really questioning their answers and then bringing them to that place where they go, wow, I never saw it like that before. I heard somebody once say that you don't notice when you fall asleep, but you notice when you wake up. And that's really that point that I hear you talking about is, they're waking up. They're like, wow, I can see now, right? I'm awake, and it can be life-changing and can change everything for them when you're able to use your coaching skills to bring that to bear and help people to see things that they weren't able to see before.
It is a privilege to be around that, Bill. It genuinely is.
So is there a different focus? I know that you said in the US you're dealing more with executive teams, and so there is a different level or position that you're typically working with, but is there a different focus that you've seen you need to work on in different areas of the world? I know you said we have a very results focused, which if you've ever read the book Foreign to Familiar, she talks a lot about that in what she calls hot and cold cultures. And we're a cold culture in the US for the most part. And we're very results oriented, and they're very more relationship oriented. So how do you have to change your focus specifically?
Yeah, so I tend to think that there's a lot of similarities in the basic nature of people, no matter where you are in the world. I mean, we all have basic physiological needs. I mean, we all need to eat, sleep, etc. But we also share other needs such as relational and social needs. And the way that shows up is, I mean, for instance, we all want to count for something. We want to work in an environment in which we can flourish. So on a strictly coaching level, what I try to do is help my clients negotiate the things that hold them back. But more importantly than that, I try to help them become energized by the things they're passionate about. And we just spoke a little bit ago about that aha moment. When somebody puts things together themselves and they see it with their own eyes and they see it clearly, wow, that's when the energy goes up. And then you see an alignment in what they're focused on and their passion toward moving toward that. It's a very energetic type of experience for them.
And you talked about removing interference points. And one of the quotes that I heard that I love is, your performance is potential minus interference. And I heard that a long time ago, and that's kind of stuck with me. And so when I hear you talk about, removing those interference points, is there a specific thing that you do to try to help people recognize what's holding them back?
Yeah, so that's wrapped up inside of the coaching conversation that I have with people. For instance, just an example of this, not all people do, but many people struggle with, like, in the area of, say, for instance, self-confidence. And for them, that lack of self-confidence can then tend to show up in, as to use your term, interference. So part of coaching then is to bring that out with them, to take a look at that, to talk about that, what might be underneath that, and then to work with them to find ways to move forward through it. Coaching's interesting, Bill, in the sense that coaching it's not like therapy in which you kind of go back to the past and you look at things that happen in your life and then you look to heal those things. I'm a big believer in therapy. I think it's an extremely important thing. Coaching tends to be future oriented with very much a results orientation. So if somebody's lacking self-confidence, for instance, we're not going to go back and try to figure out, like, what happened when they were 5 years old. I'm not trying to trivialize this. I'm just saying, not what happened when they were 5 years old and then address that. What we're actually trying to do is I work with them to direct a conversation toward getting it out in the open, and then what steps might you take to address that. And then that's when the conversation really starts, because the goal there is progress, forward movement. And if self-confidence interfering is part of interfering your performance, let's put things into place you can use in the future when you're interacting with someone. You can work through that and actually then flourish in that relationship because you're applying the steps that you want to take to be more confident.
With coaching, it's a very individualistic type of endeavor. At least I found in my coaching. And, many people, I think, want this formula, okay, if you just do this, and this. But with everybody, it seems to be a little bit different. They respond in different ways, and so it really takes somebody attuned and who's trained, and that's the difference between a coach and a good coach. And is this person who understands that, okay, this might be the normal way we would go about it, but I need to switch it up here. I need to call an audible, and to use a sports analogy, and say, hey, we're going to do things differently here because I'm seeing they're not responding, and I'm really trying to constantly check in with them and how we're going to move them forward. And so it's a really individualistic, personalized thing that you're doing, and that's awesome.
Very much so, yeah.
I keep bringing this back because you're working with people from different cultures, but language is something that often when people think about working with somebody overseas, it's one of the things like, I've talked with somebody on the phone today, I couldn't understand them. And you're working in probably even a more technical or a more nuanced way with them. So how have you found communicating with people who English might not be their first language? How does that affect the coaching process, and how have you kind of overcome that?
Well, first of all, me personally, I'm always impressed by how many I don't know, 99% of the time in our Zoom conversations, we're going full speed, having a conversation just like you and I are. Once in a while, I'll ask a team member to repeat something more slowly, but that's actually a pretty rare thing. I take the position on this that their English is much, much better than my Hindi, much, much better than my Spanish. That means they've made the effort. They want to do better at the language. And I mean just people in general. They want to communicate well. With your team, Bill, the folks that you've brought on, they've worked at it. They're actually quite accomplished in their English communication.
So it hasn't been too much of a drawback. And
it hasn't. I got to admit something to you, Bill. And here again, don't tell anybody I said this, especially your team. Honestly, though, this is absolutely the case. I've had conversations with some of your team members, Bill, in which, we might be trying to talk about a concept, whether it's personal, professional development stuff. And I'll ask them, to give me their overview of the concept, what it means to them. Literally, their verbiage, their use of the English language to convey something that I think can kind of be abstract. It's better than mine. This is a weird thing to have to admit to, but I'm quite impressed by their ability to communicate, not only on a technical level, but even to take something that might be tend toward more somewhat abstraction and put that in words. It's a commendation for your team.
Well, that's wonderful. So as a coach, and this would be cross-culturally or otherwise, do you have any communication tips for us to build deeper connections with our teams, whether it be in the U.S. or around the world?
Yeah, I do. I think the same things that allow for great communication in our own culture also works cross-culturally. So for instance, I'm a big believer in active listening. A lot of this relates to Stephen Covey's approach to seeking first to listen, then to understand. When we're communicating with someone, we have a tendency to, let's say when we're talking to someone, we have a tendency to be distracted. We're thinking about something else. We have a tendency to want to kind of jump in without really hearing them fully, without hearing them all the way through. We tend to short circuit the process and we jump in early. We tell them, oh, well, this happened to me. And we tend to make the conversation about ourselves and the things that we want to express, the things that we want to say. The whole time we're missing what they're saying. So this crosses cultures. If you want to communicate well with somebody, you really have to actively listen to them. That includes listening well, it includes listening empathetically, trying to understand what's underneath what they're saying. So that would be the first thing I would say about that. I also would mention that I'd be aware of nonverbal cues. I keep trying to figure out the number for this, but at least 50% of communication's nonverbal. So clearly that's a huge thing no matter where you are. And I try to be aware of that. I try to be aware of my clients' nonverbals as well as my own, and to kind of use those cues and pick up on them. One of the things that's important here is that our faces tend to convey micro expressions that come and go very quickly on our face, very little knowledge or control over those. So the application to that is you can't fake interest in a person or in a conversation for too long. You just can't. So the best way to have a deeper, let's say create a deeper connection with someone cross-culturally, have a genuine, authentic interest in them and what they're saying. In the same way that, Bill, when you and I would sit across the table over lunch and we were talking about how things were going, you would know if I was interested. And this applies to anyone. Have a genuine, authentic interest in what they are saying. Have a genuine, authentic interest in them. We're all real good at detecting fake. And as a result, you will not get a deeper connection when you're faking it. So it's got to be real. It's got to be intentional. It's got to be short of manipulation. You don't pay attention to someone to manipulate them into a corner. You pay attention because they have inherent value, and what they're discussing is important to you. If it's not important to you, you don't need to have that conversation. Move on. But if you're having a conversation, I would put out there, it must be important.
That's awesome. So have that focus on them, have that interest, that desire to help them, and really be putting their message first before you seek to get your message out is what I hear you saying. And that's great for any culture.
And that's great whether you don't have to be a coach. Like obviously this is stuff that I immerse myself in this stuff, and I get that. But even before I did any training as a coach, people that mentored me would explain to me, we would talk about coaching in a business setting without even talking about the discipline or the structure of coaching, quote unquote. Just how do you bring the most out of an employee? And a big part of that has got to be wanting to bring out their best. And if you're going to want to bring out somebody's best, they have to have a certain level of value to you. You can't bring out their best short of that. So those things do tie together. And again, when it's done authentically over a period of time, I think it has an impact on folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on, because you've worked in management for many years, you've worked with a lot of different people. I think a lot of our listeners are curious, like, what's it like to work with somebody overseas? There's lots of fear. There's lots of things that are unknown. They know people in the U.S. They know what to expect. And I think it was Donald Rumsfeld who once said, there's known unknowns and then there's unknown unknowns. And so for people that decide to work with somebody overseas, there's a lot of unknown unknowns. So could you kind of compare and contrast your experience? And I know that you haven't necessarily had a management, but as a coach, how do you look at people differently? Like, what are their skill set? How do you see them and say, very honestly, hey, they're really good at this. They're not as good at this. This is a challenge. This is, easier in the U.S. This is harder in the U.S. How do you define that?
Yeah, so on the management side, which would be US, in my own experience, I've just been really fortunate. I've had the opportunity to mentor high quality individuals that I've managed. And of course, that's good for me, that's good for them, that's good for the company. That's just a great thing. That being said, I've learned that sometimes a person, and I'm referring to US, sometimes a person might not be interested in growing for whatever reason. So in those cases, coaching or mentoring, it'll only bring about a limited amount of benefit. You can manage people to execute on the goals that you have for them. But in terms of growing, say, personal, professional development, to be blunt, if they're not interested in that, they're self-limiting the benefit of coaching. So for instance, one of the ways I would apply it, like if as a manager or an HR person, if I was actively looking for people to hire, I would actually look for people who have some sort of a track record of continuous growth. I mean, between their resume and interviewing, you can kind of discern, okay, what's their schooling like? Have they gone through certifications? When you interview them, do they seem curious in interviews? There's a way to identify that there's a level of curiosity in them, a desire for growing. Then that's, as someone who's looked at hundreds, maybe thousands of resumes, that's something that would jump out at me and it would make me consider that person as a possibility. Related to Staffing Global, the people that I work with inside of Staffing Global, they are talented and focused. I mean, that's part of the reason that they were hired. So for me, I'm already working with team members that have built-in motivation. Your team members might have already received significant amount of schooling. They might have several years of experience. Even so, they still have an interest in getting better and in growing. And when someone has that basic approach to life or to their work, yes, it's a much easier, I'll be blunt, it's a much easier job for me. It's a much easier task for me to work with that type of individual.
Well, I love to hear that the people are excited and, they're looking to grow, because that's the type of culture we're looking to create. And so it's wonderful that's been your experience. So is there something, this is kind of more just something you've noticed, but is there something that's been surprising to you working cross-culturally that you weren't expecting when you first started into this position?
I would say your team members are very respectful. Very respectful. Now, I was anticipating that going in. You and I actually had conversations about that. In the past, I've worked a bit in other countries, including India, and that cultural bias toward being respectful is certainly there. The level of respect among your team members is significant and I think appropriate. So if I was to say the hardest thing for me when I'm interacting with your team is to avoid references that are US based cultural references. So for an example, I might be talking about, I don't know, like a football coach's leadership philosophy, and they might think I'm talking about a different sport, which is what we would call soccer. So I'm glad that when I was in India, I played cricket when I was there many years ago. So I don't mistake that sport for baseball. Yeah, when I'm interacting with folks cross-culturally, probably I think the thing I work on the most is avoiding cultural references that might not mean a lot. So I try to keep it more universal, more general.
And sometimes I'll actually even go through the process of explaining them, the cultural references, so to give them more context as they work with some of the American. But that is very true. We take so many things for granted in our conversations. And I think that goes back to really, focusing on them and understanding what they're saying, and how do we deconstruct our conversations so that we understand and make ourselves clear. That's the other side of that. We talked about about how are we actively listening, but then when we're communicating with them is, when I say this, what does that actually mean? Would that have any meaning to them? Because there's just all of this history that we have, whether it's a baseball analogy, a football analogy, or any other thing that we might have that's so different, even just coffee culture compared to tea culture. Any of these things that we think on the surface, they do provide some sort of separation, but at the same time is when you just take a few minutes to be intentional, you can say, oh, maybe that's not quite the case with them, and maybe I need to communicate in a different way. So,
oh, Bill, that is so well put. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, no matter who you're having a conversation with, you want to be direct and clear. And so I think just having that self-awareness, whether you're talking to your brother-in-law or somebody in a different country, the goal from our communication outward is to be direct and to be clear. So direct and clarity. To that point, just being aware of it helps. So if you're in the middle of a conversation with somebody and they're in another country, just be aware that you're going to speak, for instance, you're going to speak idiomatically, meaning you might drop a phrase in there like, oh, so my brother grew a foot at college. For somebody in the US, that's a reasonable statement, but it's an idiom. For us, it means like they were young and they grew another 12 inches in height. For people in other countries, they might find it to be a weird thing to grow a third foot. So it helps to just be aware as you're speaking, be thinking in the back of your mind, am I being direct? More importantly, and to your point earlier, am I being clear? Those two things will go a long way toward really high level communication.
And I think that goes to the next part. Do you have any specific tools that you help people on their growth journey with that you could share with us? Like one or two things that they're kind of like your go-to tools in your toolbox?
Yeah, I do. So the first one is I'm a really big believer in having at least a basic understanding of your mission and vision. In other words, why you're put on the earth. To speak to an earlier point, there's a certain amount of joy, a certain amount of energy when people sort of unwrap that for themselves. Also, it's a great foundation to build off when you're discussing goals. Let me personalize this to you, Bill. One of your overarching goals in your life is to help people reach their fullest potential. And so that's like your long view goal, the goal that's out there, mission or vision, that's part of who you are. But then that gets exhibited in the short, mid, and long-term goals that you have for yourself and for your business. So part of a tool that people can use for themselves is to kind of get a handle on kind of why am I here? And then once you have that kind of true north in place, it enables you to then bring that down into very direct application as to, okay, let me develop my goals for the next year, for this business, for me personally. For this type of thing, Bill, there's assessments on the internet. You can get those, download those. I also have a PDF that I use and I make it available to my clients. So that would be the first thing. I would say just get a handle on why you're here. Just get a handle on that. That'll permeate through and really be helpful to you. A hidden tool, part of who you are as a person, and that tool is curiosity. And I'll press it further, insatiable curiosity. If you have insatiable curiosity, not only will you grow, but you'll put yourself in a position to help others grow. I tend to think we take curiosity for granted. We don't really think about it. It's just part of the air that we breathe, but I think it's an incredibly helpful tool. And so maybe an application for this would be just to spend a day purposefully, actively being curious. And then at the end of the day, see if that benefited you or not. My guess is it will. And then I would suggest if it does, try to cultivate an overall mindset of curiosity. How can I do this with my business? How can I do this with my personnel? How can I do this with my family? Curiosity is the first step to getting you to those things. So those are the tools I would mention.
I love that. I love, I was telling my team, about being curious just the other day and how important that is to ask the questions. And I think that so many times we kind of beat that out of our young children. It's like, oh, okay, why? And I'm sick of hearing why, right? And like, no, go away. But really encouraging that curiosity is super important, both in your teams and in your children. And I love that. So as we're getting close to the end here, what advice would you give a company or business leader that's open to hiring people overseas, but still might have some apprehension. You're on the coaching side, so you see people sharing sometimes some very deep things, and you also see what type of work that they're able to do and interact with them in a very deep way. What type of advice would you give to that business owner who's thinking about this?
Where I would go with this, Bill, is I think that companies like Staffing Global, they've removed a lot of the unknown, a lot of the mystery of what will happen if you hire somebody from overseas. So, as a business leader, here's what you get as a result of doing this. And this is what I mean by taking the mystery out. You'll know the expense going in. You'll know that you'll have a talented, focused staff person whose training and experience is very much up to the task. You know that person will interact professionally and respectfully with you and your team. So as we say, I'll use an idiom here. As we say in the US, the proof is in the pudding. So for Staffing Global, for instance, you could try Staffing Global for a few months at a very low risk and yet with a high potential of rewards. One of the reasons I like working with entrepreneurs is that they are willing to operate in innovative spaces. Here's the reality. International staffing for US-based companies is one of the most significant innovations in global businesses over the last generation, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. So to me, it's worth a try.
I appreciate that. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Jim. This has been awesome. Love having these conversations. I appreciate you taking the time. And as we wrap up here, where can people learn more about your work?
Well, thank you, Bill. First of all, let me say thank you for your time today for this conversation. As always, I enjoy our conversations greatly, and I count it a privilege to be part of the Staffing Global team with the opportunity to work with the talented people you've brought on board. So thank you for all that. I appreciate it. As far as learning more about me, I have a website, Jim Wall Coaching. I would say if someone wants to just kind of get an overview, by all means, feel free to check out jimwallcoaching.com and take a look.
Well, thanks again and have a wonderful day. And thanks for joining us here on Beyond the Office, leading and building remote teams. So if you'd like to learn more about remote staffing, feel free to message us for our free guide, The 7 Deadly Sins of Remote Staffing, and how to make sure that you don't commit them and you're successful in your remote hiring journey.